after 9 years, I think the longest probably was a week at the same place. And that was something like when that suddenly ended and like I was at home and like did not like, oh, where am I right now? This is like, that's where I realized that's pretty fucked up.
This podcast is produced by Amplitude Ventures, your partner in early stage startups.
Co-founder of Primephonic, Simon Eder, shares his unique journey from the classical music industry to creating a streaming service, which was acquired by Apple. We also talk about the challenges and triumphs of transforming classical music for the digital age. Hey guys, welcome back to the Sound Connections podcast. Today we have a really interesting episode with Simon Eder. Welcome.
Thank you very much. You're welcome.
I had the pleasure of meeting you in Poland, where we were both speaking at Music Tech Poland event. And you have an incredibly interesting background as an entrepreneur with, a brand everyone knows, Apple Music, and very particularly Apple Music Classical, where you built a company that got acquired by them. And today we're going to sort of discover your entrepreneurial journey and the journey of the company and sort of try to understand how that went about. So thank you, Simon, for doing that. For the people who don't know you, Simon, who are you and what do you do?
So basically, my background is not necessarily music tech. I started basically back in culture and kind of made my way to music. Basically, it was more of a coincidence. I started in the music industry at a record label. So my background is arts, theater, music, culture, branding, communications. And I had the opportunity, was asked to join the new team, the new management team of a record label in the Netherlands. So the label basically was founded in early 2000s, and they were going through a transformation, like trying to get the label ready for the digital era. So the label was very tech, like very CD heavy, not very prepared for the digital side, and that's a little bit where, let's say, my music tech era kind of started, and where also like Primephonic was born.
Yeah, so sort of starting with the end, you guys ended up being acquired and turned into sort of Apple Music Classical. So that's sort of the
Yeah.
not the end. Obviously, there's been a story since, but that's sort of what you built to. When you were joined this company, what qualifications did you have to help them digitalize?
I'm wondering, in all honesty, thinking back, I'm wondering myself, I would not have picked me, to be completely honest, because my background was, let's say, somewhat classical. I've worked in classical concert halls. I was familiar with, let's say, the music side of things. The record industry was completely new to me, and also to my co-founder back then. So the other colleague who joined as the second director. So he back then was the managing director. I was the marketing director, and I mean, we were assigned with the task to kind of transform the label into the digital era, and we had zero clue about the recording industry, which was tough at many times. But I think it kind of had the advantage that we really just tried to understand everything from scratch and don't take anything for granted, if it makes sense, or like just we really like we had to learn, and we had to learn fast. Yeah, so I think like that kind of helped. But in all honesty, in terms of like what qualified me, I I have to say,
Yeah.
now thinking back, not that much.
We'll cover that, and I'm sure that's going to show itself in the story and how this got built at the end of the day. But let's try to set the scene for the label first. So again, you joined, later in the journey when it comes to sort of the label side, and wanted to transform. What was the state of the label? Like, what was the past of that company?
So the label was basically founded from three former Philip record label executives, and they had founded the label basically at the end of the 90s, early 2000s, with the focus on SACD, so Super Audio CD, which for a while could have turned into the successor of the CD. So basically, it was, instead of stereo, multi-channel, higher quality. And I mean, for very long, like a new music format replaced the previous one because it had better sound quality. And that was also, let's say, their assumption back then. And they wanted to be the first ones building a vast catalog in high quality recordings on Super Audio. obviously the super audio never replaced the CD, and the music industry took a different path because of digitalization, and suddenly it became more important to make the music format portable with like MP3s, and the sound quality wasn't that relevant anymore. And that was basically, yeah.
In order to do a pursuit for some time before you joined,
Mm.
ultimately, you know, not pursuing the right thing, if you talk from sort of those terms, they must have had some sort of financing mechanism that could help them do that. Like, did they raise capital, or like how did they operate that?
At the very beginning, it was really just the three of them, and they were raising capital over time with getting various investors on board. Exactly.
Hmm.
And by the time when I joined, basically they were reaching their retirement age. They were also like able to grow the catalog and grow revenue over. It was a little bit more than the first. How long was it? 12, 13 years, basically. But then with digitalization, obviously, like CD sales went down drastically. The old kind of rules didn't apply anymore. Um, and there was back then just a question mark what to do. Like, should the catalog be sold? Should the entire label be sold to someone else? Or is another path just trying to get the label ready for the kind of digital era? And that's
Mm,
where I was part of the new management team.
amazing. Okay. So to some degree, from a entrepreneurial path, you sort of start from scratch. Obviously, you have some strength to stand on. You have a catalog. You have, some original founders with understanding what it means to have investors and build tech to some degree or invest in a tech approach. So you had some shoulders to stand on, but still like very much from scratch. Like, how did you go about thinking about digitalize? What was your first sort of approach?
So basically, back then, I mean, it sounds like centuries away, but it's not that long. Streaming wasn't that big of a thing yet, especially for classical. So, like in the early, like it was 2010, 11, 12. Back then, digital was basically downloading or downloads, basically iTunes, Amazon. Um, and we kind of felt that, first of all, we're not proactively enough pushing on that element. We're not really steering, let's say, the distribution network on that side. We don't understand as a label well enough how that side of things is working. And we also started to because like the high quality was a big asset for the label, and it had a very audiophile followership. So we also integrated a download store for the most high-res files on our own website that you couldn't download anywhere else. And we kind of knew, well, it's a very niche product to download basically the DSD files, which is, let's say, the studio file that you would really produce at a recording. So we made them available, and there weren't back then that many online stores that were doing that. So that was the first approach, and then in parallel, also, let's say, proactively building out the distribution, the international distribution network, and pushing it and trying to understand it better.
Mm.
Optimism. We
So
also like, sorry, yeah.
to some degree, because like the first value proposition of the label was this prosumer, almost like this consumer that really cares about the quality. And then you, the first step was basically a digital version of that. Like, whoever wants to download digital music will provide the highest possible quality they can get
Mhm.
this digitally. So that was, it feels like it's very much in the spirit of what the first sort of iteration of the company was.
Yes, exactly. And basically, also what came in parallel was also thinking, what is the function of a label with, let's say, also with the changing aspects of how relevant is it for an artist, or what's the role, what's the relationship between artist and the label. That was also something we tried to kind of intensify and work out a little bit more.
Okay, you talked about sort of how to push distribution internationally. Again, I'm sometimes way too young. So what do you mean by that? Like, what was the effort of push internationally? What do you mean by that?
So when we joined, we had the former distribution partner that we had. So you would have the distribution partner for physical, taking care really of, let's say, managing the CD stock. And then also taking care of, let's say, the entire ecosystem of bringing the recordings onto iTunes, bringing them onto Amazon. We wanted to understand that better, to also see who's downloading our stuff, where and why, and how can we improve that proactively. And there was also the physical side of things. So basically, stock management, reprints, that aspect, which was a bit of a nightmare, because I think like 2 months after we started, the distribution partner went bankrupt, which meant our stock was in a warehouse, but we kind of knew that the warehouse, once it really, like, with bankruptcy, we probably very soon will not have access to the warehouse and to our stock. So I remember
Okay,
that back.
that makes sense. Okay, so you basically you still so much in cutting edge of digitalization that a lot of the sort of logistic pieces in distribution of music still wasn't probably in place.
Yes, yes. Was like at the very beginning, it was still very focused on the logistical, like, operations of CDs. Like, that was really the,
Mm.
let's say, 95% of, let's say, the label's daily operations was focused on that. Yeah.
So basically, there was a mixture between, okay, how do we pursue a new model, which is digital distribution, high quality files, but then there was also, we still have an existing business of CDs. How do we effectivize that part of the business? Was that the sort of the dual pursuit there?
Exactly. And I mean, for very long, physical also remained extremely relevant. Um, if you like, with classical, which was label's core repertoire, in the CD era, classical had a share of 4%, roughly, from all music, and that went down in the digital era to almost like 1%. So you can tell that there was some kind of gap, and still there is still, you can tell that the gap is still there for multiple reasons, and that was the element that we tried to kind of fill. Like, how can we get our share from 1% to the 4%,
Mm.
in the digital world?
Is that, is that to some degree because there's a, well, a consumer, well, a consumer that listens to classical music tend to be more concerned about the physical medium or the quality of the physical medium? Like, what was the reasoning for that?
Not only the consumer, but also, I would say, label executives and artists.
Okay.
Very, like, it was a highly sensitive topic, like, going or branching out into digital formats. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, I have a slight background in classical music. I'm a Royal Tonmeister by degree, which I sort of regret I did because I did a popular music producer and audio engineering background, and then went into classical music just to try something, and I almost failed because I suddenly need to learn a lot of classical things. But I was good at the engineering part. But one of the things of my experience is like it's almost like an athlete light experience being a classical musician on us. It's like it is repetition and perfection, everything from, overtone harmonics of one particular instrument to what room you play in to like there's
Yeah.
so much related to perfection, or not, maybe perfection is the wrong word, but like, you know, um, the pursuit of the optimal scenario for
Yes.
that performance to happen. So I guess that also sort of shined through which medium the preferred consumers to listen to their music on.
Totally. Yes. Yes. Definitely.
So I guess that somehow when everything crashed for music, because of the digital age, that revenue was somewhat sustained in the classical a little bit more? Like, was the sort of the fall slower?
The fall was slower, and the switch to digital happened, or happens, still, with a bit delay. Indeed, indeed. And I mean, you could tell that several, especially classical labels, they did not make it through the transition if they didn't focus early enough on digital. There was a lot
Mm.
of hesitation.
Yeah, so if you wanna put it on the edge, I might be wrong about this. Like, to some degree, you could argue that you had some element of foresight. Obviously, you were in the middle of it, but then you could also see the market reacting faster to certain parts of the music industry than your own, and you had a tiny bit more time to adapt, I guess?
Also true. I mean, for sure, one, probably more practical element, which I think also kind of caused the delay, it was basically metadata, or the way how metadata worked back then on most platforms, because it was really not suitable for classical.
And
So, like, I think, like, there's also this pragmatic reason why it took a while before a lot of digital platforms became that attractive, because of problems you wouldn't have with non-classical repertoire.
Mm, that makes sense.
If it makes sense, or just to
Yeah, yeah.
explain, let's say if you have a Beethoven recording, like Beethoven Fifth Symphony, there is no original version. Like they're all cover versions. Beethoven didn't record anything himself. So whatever you record, it's a cover version. And you will have 2,200, in some cases you really have hundreds of recordings of the same piece.
Yeah.
And trying to reflect it in a digital structure, it's a bit different compared to, let's say, world of pop music, where you really always have the authentic
Hmm.
recording in most
That
cases.
makes sense. Okay. So the whole industry didn't adapt to digital that fast, and therefore also consumers, didn't really have the possibility to listen to classical music in the optimal environment or the optimal repertoire that quickly either.
Mm.
So that makes a whole lot of sense, and that also really makes sense of how you somewhat could survive the digital transformation from being in the old industry, but still somewhat sort of progressive in technology, and then going on to succeeding in the digital era as well. So after you've tried to work on this distribution in the digital realm, and then also sort of the logistics, what happened? Did you find a way to make this more effective?
Well, so one of the first things that we did with the label, in parallel to what you just mentioned, was, let's say, building. We did a rebranding process. Also in respect, like how can our label be more relevant brand wise on digital platforms, and also, let's say, redoing our own website, which kind of had this download store, and that was basically back then the kind of initial, like the first step for Primephonic, because we said, okay, well, now having a download store in high res only for one label is a bit of a waste of effort. Like, why don't we join synergies with a lot of other high res labels to target in a first step, let's say, the audiophile classical listener. And we kind of like started with a new brand. We didn't want to ask other labels to join under our label name, and that's when we kind of made the first step for Primephonic.
Yeah, did you
So the beginning was really,
did you flip that out
mm,
into a separate company, or was it still the same company but with a different brand?
at the very beginning, it was a completely separate standalone product and brand, but basically just a sub product of our own company, of our own label.
Mm.
And when we presented back then the kind of idea that we have, and that we're also partnering up with other labels, and we shared that with our shareholders, and that we would see their potential for some additional revenue, they really liked the idea that much that they said, okay, well, what if you take it one step further? What are the challenges ahead that you would identify? Bring us the business play, bring us the business plan, bring us the forecast. And that was basically really when we then, like, developed the business plan for Primephonic, and said, okay, well, download will come to an end at a certain stage. We can still make some money perhaps over the next 10 years. But we also see a big opportunity for streaming service focusing on classical. Back then it was only Spotify, and Spotify was in it rather early days. And classical didn't work that well back then.
Mm.
And that's how it kind of started.
So try to explain what was the end product before you got acquired. Like, how did Primephonic look before you got acquired by Apple?
Right before we got acquired by Apple, it was a standalone app, offering the entire catalog of classical music. So basically, think of think of any kind of streaming app that you have in mind, with the core difference that, let's say, the way how we dealt with metadata, and the way how we dealt with the curation was really tailored for the classical listener.
Mm.
And the metadata definitely was the big USP, or was also, let's say, why Apple now kind of decided to have a standalone app called Apple Music Classical, in addition to Apple Music, because it simply works in terms of metadata, in terms of search, different than the rest of the
Mm.
music.
That makes sense. So, obviously, we don't need to go into specifics because you are under NDA with a giant. But What do you believe is the reason why they acquired the company? Was that for the tech stack? Was it for the brand? Was it for the sort of the catalog? Like, what was the reasoning from their side as far as you understood?
Definitely not the catalog, or not in the first step, because basically the catalog Apple already had access to. Like, Apple had access to the entire classical catalog. The relevant part really was, let's say, the tech and the metadata, the way how we dealt with tech, with metadata within our tech, the tech approach
Mm.
that we had with metadata.
And do you so when you talked about the issues with classical in the digital age with all these, well, everything is a cover version, there's many versions. Um, is that basically the magic thing you cracked? Like the logic of like we need to create something that addresses the way the metadata is sort of structured here or used? Is that the key to all of this to some degree?
The metadata, and in a way, if you break it down, the metadata, which kind of shows in two ways. So I mean, I shared now, let's say, the challenge of, let's say, the cover version. But then another very annoying thing in the early days of the streaming platforms for classical was you weren't able to find the entire work. So you have Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and it's broken down into several movements, and they come with an order. And in the digital, like within the streaming platforms, you were broken down just like into tracks.
Mm.
So you had a completely random mixture. It was almost impossible to kind of listen to the music the way it was intended, the way it was composed, because of the track element in a second level.
Yeah. So to
And
some degree, it's like, each movement is like a scene in the movie, but if you don't have the connection between watching the whole movie and its sort of continuity, the music makes
exactly,
less sense.
exactly, or exactly. That's a great comparison. Or like, you're on Netflix, you want to watch season 2, episode 3, 4, 5, and you're not able to identify, am I in season 1? Am I in season 2?
Yeah.
Episode 3, 4. So even that structure was basically impossible to find in the early days for classical music in the streaming platform.
Yeah, because most, listeners of classical music also understands that. Like it's not the same way of listening to traditional music playlist. Like there's a storytelling, there's a context, there's a history, there's to some degree like a big intellectual part of classical music that's beyond just the simple consumption. There's a lot
Mm.
of context, and that's what we're addressing. Um, so has any of the other streaming services following you guys address that approach with metadata? Like, have you seen an adaptation?
It improved. It massively improved over the last decade. So let's say when we started with Primephonic, and when we started working on it, that was back in 2014, 15, before Apple came in, or before even Apple launched Apple Music. And I remember definitely, let's say, it was addressed and improved from most of the players within the last 10 years. It got significantly better. Yeah.
The way that we talk about it is sort of very almost like an academic dissection of what happened, and because I really like to have that angle, but I'm sure that it was not a straight path and just joy and win on win. Like, what was the actual situation? Was this a battle to make happen?
A battle, a, a joyful battle. Let's put it like this. It was a joyful battle in the sense that, I mean, there were multiple barriers. Like, we had several critical moments, I would say. So one, for example, was when okay, well, we now have, let's say, some kind of funding in place, and we now have a business plan where we want to offer a streaming platform for classical. And we knew in order to be successful, we need the entire catalog of classical music. No customer will pay, let's say, an additional 9.99, whatever the exact tier is, if then the classical listener isn't finding the entire catalog. That also meant we had to get all the major labels on board, and the idea of niche streaming service, like only licensing a part of the entire, like only licensing a part of the repertoire, was completely new, first of all. We also introduced a different payout model, in the sense that, like, with most streaming platforms, you would have you're paid per stream track. And that also is a bit of a challenge for classical music, because you have extremely long tracks sometimes in classical music. It's very common to have a track that can be up to 15 minutes, which at the same time means you will get paid for 15 minutes the same amount as for a 3-minute piece. So take one album, 60 minutes of music. For classical can be 3 tracks, for non-classical can be 9 tracks. So you even cannot make the same, you have a completely different financial business model behind it that is very disadvantageous for classicals. We changed it to streamed second, basically, payout, which was already a challenge to explain why we want to do that and why we think that makes sense and why this should be introduced for classical. And getting as well all of the majors on board. Yeah, so that was one of the battles where we know, okay, well, we have to do that, because if not, we can shut down again.
So I have the privilege of speaking with a lot of founders, a lot of startups, and scale ups, and I'm also fairly technical myself. So I have like a rough idea what it takes to build a streaming service, everything from data science to the actual sort of app and everything in between. Like it's immensely complex. And you said you and your sort of co-founder that took this on, the managing director and you as a marketing director, you didn't really have any qualifications. Like, how did you become good enough as a team to actually pull this off?
Um, in all honesty, I think with growing with the right people and with the right ambition and having, I would say, this kind of weird mixture of really not being naive, but at the same time be naive in the sense like, oh, well, we'll make it work. Because, like, now thinking back, it was a complete nightmare. Just like even just ingesting the entire catalog. It Now so many things could be so much easier and faster with AI, but back then, like, also the metadata problem, we wouldn't have it to that extent anymore at all. 10 years ago, very, very different story. Yeah, I think it's a mixture of, like, really growing with the right people, and not giving up in a way.
But so how does the team sort of structure look like? Like, did you have a whole team of engineers and salespeople? Like, what was the situation at the end or the acquisition?
At the end, by the end and by the time of the acquisition, we had our entire tech team in house. That was not the case at the beginning. That was, for example, one of the things where back then we were kind of wondering, to what extent are we insourcing? Like, should we develop it from scratch in house, or are we working with an external tech partner? And our approach was that, let's say, we start with an external tech partner, and gradually, once we've made the first steps and we get the understanding, well, once we're learning, we start to insource. And by the time of the acquisition, we were running our tech team in house. Like, the team was roughly 50 people. So I would say the big part was the tech team. Also, data ingestion was a very key part. Marketing, operations. Yeah.
So if you just follow the trajectory of any other streaming platform out there, I'd be very surprised if you were profitable by the end. Like it's it takes a lot of time to build up users. Like I can imagine there was a lot of investors that sort of took this chance and bet on it. Like what was the situation? Was it primarily financed by external capital the majority of the time, or did you actually make any revenue that could sustain the team?
We were making, by the time of the acquisition, we were making relevant or substantial, I would say, revenue, but haven't reached the level of being profitable. That was still down the road. Um, I would say we were very lucky was that, let's say, our investor setup. So the investors were also the owners of the label, like a broader setup, who kind of made the journey possible. And we had it was pretty much at the time when we were also starting the very first conversations with Apple, when we were also considering to start onboarding or work with VCs. Um, and there were then another complete level of complexity, because we back then even weren't ready for us mentally to kind of sell already. We didn't have that. We did not. We thought, okay, well, that will come later at a later stage. So it kind of was a surprise back then.
Okay, so ultimately there was a pursuit of selling this at one point. Like that was the um capitalistic goal, I guess, that you were trying to realize on behalf of your investors.
There were multiple. That was one of them. One of the possible outcomes for sure. But also other scenarios could have been possible.
Mm.
But that was one of them. Yeah.
So I think a lot of these journeys also there's so many moving pieces in succeeding in entrepreneurship. I haven't myself succeeded, so I can't firsthand speak of it. But other than academic approach, um, but one of the components is having capital that is supporting whatever journey the company is taking. So, how big a part do you believe that was that you had strong owners that were seemingly willing to be patient and also quite comfortable in living on the unknown of where this was going?
A very big factor for sure. But not the only one. I think one of the other elements is that, like, with a startup and funding becomes available, you can burn money so easily,
Mhm.
and it's burning so fast. I think it- of course you have to find the balance of, okay, well, where do you really want to grow, and where do you want to invest at the same time. From my perspective, there's a big risk with burning too much on the burning too much too quickly. Um, I think, like, that's also a potential risk
Mm.
for failing.
Yeah, so operational, um, well, good operations, I guess, good management of cash, and make sure you're not burning money is a big part of the journey. You said that um, the offer for acquisition came as a surprise. Try to sort of paint that scenario for me. What was happening at the company at that time?
It was so basically it was at the pretty much at the beginning of the pandemic, which was hard because we didn't know how exactly it would influence daily operations.
Yeah.
Turned out not at the end. Turned out operations went operation sales, like they went ahead pretty much like planned. But that was when first conversations kind of started out of nowhere. And I mean, I just remember that was 2020, and 3 years before, in 2017, we had a small team in New York. They were taking care of the US market and operations on site. And I was sitting with a former colleague there, and we said, where do we want to be in 3 years from now? Over drinks, let's dream big, blah blah blah. And we said, okay, well, yes, Apple. And we put it in the calendar for, like, in 3 years. I think it was somewhat like, I don't know, January 2020 or February 2020, something like that. Um, or March. And I remember sitting in front of the computer. This pop up comes, like, gosh, wow, that's what we're thinking. 3 years. Um, Now we're still. I mean, we're still around. We're growing. Everything's going according to plan. But at the same time, you have so many new barriers always coming, uh, and there's the pandemic. And I think 8 weeks later, the first contact was made from Apple back then. Yeah. So put it in your diary. That's what I would put something in your diary for the future.
Were you tired at this point?
For sure. I think, in all honesty, there's always a level of tiredness. It comes, and um I think back then it was for sure also because of, let's say, the pandemic changing a lot of operations. And anyway, they change in a startup all the time.
Mm,
I mean,
mm,
it's like 80% failing. You learn, you get up. I mean, I think like that's one of the positive things. Like you just become very fast. It's not about finger pointing. It's just like about finding out what works and what doesn't work and how you can improve it.
mm.
And it's not so much if you start to finger point, you're kind of lost already.
Yeah.
Um, but for sure, there were a lot of tiring moments. And I think like back then it was just the beginning of let's say a very long process, very long conversation. Like I think that was also that part, the entire conversations that we then had ahead, they were also very long, and very, very like with a lot of open ends. I mean, obviously you go out by the time the deal is done and it looks like one shiny announcement, but all the uncertainty and all the kind of question marks that were coming before, you don't see at that moment.
Mm, yeah.
And exhaustion, and also exhaustion to a certain extent, yeah.
Yeah, so one thing is sort of running a company, another thing is also, having this deal at the table to some degree might feel like the light at the end of the tunnel, not because the journey is that terrible, but, like, still, like, it's sort of a reward, for hard years' work, and that in itself can also be quite exhausting, I guess.
Mm.
Um, how was your life affected when this was completed?
When it was completed, how it was affected, in all honesty, with relief of like closing a chapter in a way that you kind of want to close a chapter. Um, Although basically when it started, we didn't think of closing the chapter yet. We're like, okay, well, we're still writing the book. And like somewhere in the midst, we're like, okay, well, is this perhaps now how we kind of are writing the end of that chapter? So I think it was a mixture of relief, of course, also being proud, but also letting go a level of exhaustion.
Yeah. And financially for investors, owners, do you think, like, that was a good experience? Like, also a lot of the owners, including yourself, had been on a quite long journey, to get there.
Yes. I mean, so in that regard, I would say, having in mind how much, especially such a like a startup that is, as in this case, B2C, which is financially extremely challenging. Like
Very.
I like the B2B, the B2C part, extremely challenging. What you also have to invest. Um, I mean, I made some money. I'm still working. It like allowed me to do things that otherwise probably would not have done. But it puts me at ease, let's say, with some things. But it's not the kind of success story that some people might imagine. "Oh, well, if the company where you were a part of it, you co-founded, you're flying around with the helicopter and that's the new life." No, that's not what the reality is. Um, Also, basically, because there was a lot of investment needed to get that far where we went.
Mm. Yeah, and that's also the typical thing I hear with music tech is, like, we talked before we did the interview, like, the perceived, notion of music tech and how that works, and
Yeah.
one of the things is, yeah, well, success is success, 100%. But I think there's also, it's healthy to understand that financial success in music tech might be a tiny bit different than
Mm,
than other industries, and the reality is healthy to balance. Also, behalf of whoever's taking a risk on both the founder side and capital side, that
mm,
yes, there's a win to be had, but even when you succeed, the math might not be comparable. I'm not saying necessarily in your case, but might not be comparable to alternatives, of similar,
mm.
pursuit and effort. Um, do you believe you would have put that entrepreneurial energy somewhere else than music tech if you had sort of had an opportunity to do it again and be younger as well?
Yes. I mean, not that for me, it's not so much, let's say, about the specific industry, but I have to say there is. despite all the, let's say, challenges that I mentioned, but there's something that I um like, that it is a fit for me personally in terms of, let's say, company culture that you probably need in such a sense. And like from that perspective, yes, also in the sense that, let's say, with that experience, it's kind of, how should I say, both. Like you get more relaxed with certain things. Um, you've learned your lesson, and you can look back on something and ask yourself, okay, did I have to go that far mentally for myself, or like where is it healthy? Where does it become unhealthy, for example? I mean, I have to say now, the level of, for so many years, like the pandemic was, I think, really the first time, when a pandemic hit, it was the first time that I was sleeping in the same bed at home for more than 2 weeks or more than 10 days. Uh, After 9 years, I think the longest probably was a week at the same place.
Mm.
Um, and that was something like when that suddenly ended, and like I was at home and like did not like, "Oh, where am I right now?" I, this is like, that's where I realized that's pretty fucked up. Like doing that for 9 years almost constantly in a row,
Yeah.
that wouldn't work. Like what? Like now thinking back, what would happen if, I don't know, an health issue comes in, or like, if you have family and a family member comes sick, or you have children, I that would not be that easy, or I would not be sure if that would be combinable.
Mm.
I thought would have been combinable,
Yeah.
to be honest.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing about entrepreneurship is also understanding how much it costs. Like I personally, I've been an entrepreneur for 14 years in many different aspects, small business and then more startups. Um, and in any financial terms, I haven't succeeded yet. Like I've definitely built things that, has its merit. And also Amplitude, as we run it now, we're around 50 people. Like it also has its merit. Very far from sort of the end game. But I've made a conscious choice now. Like I work, between 25 and 30 hours a week, just because like I
Mm.
just realized like, I have 3 small kids. I cannot wait. Like I cannot take the chance of waiting until I'm there to slow down. I just can't because, I'm still young. I'm only 32, but again, there's only so much you can take. So I've proactively chosen, okay, great. It might suffer the potential of the company to some degree, but also realizing like, okay, I need to slow down. I need to run a lot more. I need to spend time with the kids. I need to be present. So I'm trying to take that sort of joy before I'm actually earned it to some degree, just with the realization that I speak with so many founders. Like I speak with hundreds of founders and just through this podcast, many, many as well. Um, and I sort of painted a picture of what it takes and say, okay, I can pay that price, but not that fast. It will take longer for me because I need to take it slower. Does that make sense?
It makes complete sense. I mean, you said something that like kind of triggered me now. Like you said, you cannot wait until you're there. And that's so true. And that's like that's something I would have never asked myself during the period.
Mm.
Now it's clear. Now for me, it's clear. It's not about getting there. It's about like the journey. And do I want that? And I don't know where there is. In all honesty, I think that's also the danger. You put it there. There.
Yeah.
When are you there? And what if you don't get there?
Mm.
And you might lose sight of a lot of things if you're only trying to get to that there. And that's not something, yeah, like it makes so much sense, and that's something that I now also, I would say, I've realized it's not only about getting there, yes, but that's a goal, but
No, no.
that's not the only
It,
that's
it,
not the only goal.
no, it's funny. I was having a conversation with my wife, I guess, yesterday, and we always have these conversations. Is it worth it? Because there's a lot of personal cost, there's a lot of stress, there's a lot of responsibility.
Mm.
And my answer in the past used to be, well, like I've worked so hard for this goal for so long, I can't let go. And now the conversation has changed. Is no, I can't change this because all this freedom and flexibility I have now, I can't find anywhere
Mm.
else, which is a quite interesting thing. And obviously, I can sort of do that because I've paid my dues. Maybe not in success, but in hard work. So like I've laid the foundation that I know the ship can run without me being there at all times. But still, it's interesting how that has switched. And I think that's also what founders need to realize. Like you're sacrificing so much to pursue that goal, and you need to find that worth probably in between because again, not talking about your specific example, but that illusion of this big payday and the
Mm,
helicopters that you said, like that might very well not be the case. And also
mm.
you're probably not necessarily going to find your happiness there. Um, but where were like what did your life look like after you got acquired? Like what do you spend time on? Like what was your next chapter?
So basically, after we got acquired, I was still so basically I was director of both companies, Primephonic and the record label Pentatone. And by the time of the acquisition, I had also operationally already a strong focus on the label still. Yet at the same time, for me personally, there was this kind of okay, well, if it's only the label, it becomes boring or it becomes not enough. Like I think basically that for sure, let's say having both of these companies and having them operating in parallel was challenging and definitely in many cases too much, but at the same time it would not have been enough to only have for me like to only have, let's say, the label side. And I back then already had an offer, or briefly after got an offer for an agency, for an artist management agency. So that was when the pandemic was kind of coming to an end. um to join an artist management agency, where the intention was how can you kind of now take the pandemic as an opportunity to kind of rethink artist management, and how could the agency not just like go back to the old way. And I did that for not that long, for probably 1.5 years, because let's say our the way how we were thinking forward didn't really match, or like let's say the ideas of how we could innovate or not innovate wasn't the 100% match. And it was basically until after that when I kind of did what I had in mind right after. So basically I did then the very cliche traveling alone through the world in Asia for a while, which was this kind of delayed, hey, I'm doing this because now I can. So that came basically with a delay, not right after the acquisition, but 1.5 years later.
Wow. And where are you now? Like where's your life right now?
Where's my life right now? I joined a startup again last year, which in all honesty, if you would have asked me 2 3 years ago, am I going to do this? Like, nope, nope, been there, done that. I've written that chapter already. It ends with Apple. I'm not ruining that chapter with now a potential second attempt. But I joined another startup last year as basically a late co-founder, and started to work on a project which I always wanted to do. Also a bit cliche, and I would not have been doing it now without having the kind of financial security or safety that I have because of the acquisition, which is opening a bar in Vienna. I'm currently working on. So I'm running between construction site and startup life. Yeah.
Amazing.
So right before, I'm just like I'm coming still with a little bit of dirt in my hair. There's a little bit of like rest of bricks are still in my hair. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, it's been incredibly interesting to hear about the story. Um, and I think, my most important takeaway is cynically almost that we need to have more education about what the actual outcomes are of these acquisitions. And again, I don't want to point this as a negative story. This is a very positive story. So everyone listening, as Damien right, is it can be transformational. But I think, because a lot of these deals are under NDAs, as any acquisitions are. But I think especially in the music industry, there tends to be, a lack of transparency of like what happens when you sell a company. Um, there is this misunderstanding of the metrics like what does it take to build a great startup in a streaming space? Like, how much does it cost to acquire customers, and like is it worth it from a metric standpoint, and in what situations doesn't make sense? Like all these things are not very clear. It's not very gathered and structured, which I think is sort of a shame. And really, that's sort of how we met in Poland. That my talk was about how not to do a music tech startup based on sort of our initial findings in the space. And I think our talk today really also helps exemplify that, both the path to success and sort of what randomness of timing and industry and consumption patterns happen, but also what diligence went into it and how much hard effort it was to achieve an exit
Yeah.
and what that actually meant. But it's hard to find those stories. It's hard to understand those generally. Um, have you experienced founders in your network that's been in similar paths? Like, can you find people around you where you can resonate with their journey and your journey?
You mean like found like that like are in for the same intention, or
No,
we're basically this?
it's sort of the club of exited founders in music tech, where you have a common understanding of what you've been through and where you are now. Like, have you found any community around that?
Yes, there are. There are definitely several of them where you feel like, okay, well, it's like very comparable story. I know the struggle. Um, then there are also very often like moments where you think, okay, well, this will be someone's underestimating how they trying to solve a problem. Like okay, well, this is they think it too easy sometimes, and like don't get me wrong, like I think we were doing the same at the beginning. Especially music tech, it's both. I think it on the one hand varies. Like there are rules, but you just have to know them. You have to understand. You have to understand. You have to understand all the music law elements. You have to understand master rights. You have to understand publishing, and you can find these rules. They're out there, but understand them. You really have to understand them, and otherwise, basically, no chance. I think you will run at an issue later if you don't understand them in music tech. And there are not that many music companies where I would think, okay, well, you will not at a certain stage have to think about publishing rights, master rights, that they in some way or another, even if they might be not relevant for you directly, but they will be very relevant for your client. Um, so not understanding them, I think, will kind of break already a certain level of success potentially.
Mm. Well, Simon, I also appreciate, like, really was very honored to also have you at, Music Tech Poland. Not that I was a part of the arranging part, but like I was surprised to see there, and very surprised to see that you also spent your time trying to give this information to other founders and share your story. So I really appreciate that. Um, Simon, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining the podcast, and I hope to see you again soon. I don't really know when we'll meet next time, but I'm sure we'll meet somewhere.
Would be great.
Yeah,
It was also my pleasure. Hopefully soon.
hopefully soon. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you.